These are the general rules for the Next War series. I have tried to cover the rules as generally as possible without highlighting an individual system. I'm very enthusiastic about the system. I played the Next War, the late 1970s Dunnigan simulation of the European front, and then the Victory Games NATO game in the mid-1980s, and then I really liked Crisis Korea, which I played in the early 90s. And now we have the Next War series, Next War Poland, India, Pakistan, Taiwan, and Korea. And so the coverage I give here is for the most important rules for those that are not familiar with the system, but there's absolutely no replacing actually reading the rules themselves. Although this video is rather long and it highlights many of the issues, there are a great many rules I did not cover. For group playing among the students, I recommend that given your particular responsibility, you focus on the sets of rules that you're most likely to encounter, and you roughly examine the other rules that are not going to affect you as directly. But there's a lot of sharing of resources, so you should have some idea about other geographical areas and the way that the other platforms operate, and that every resource is scarce and every commander is going to try to maximize the application of force in their area. So there should be sort of a broad insight into how to share resource and to work synergistically, and sometimes to sacrifice for yourself to reinforce success somewhere else. Most importantly, there are a lot of discrete rules whose effects are geometrically more important when combined together. So you have to think about how to combine the many different methods of movement, the many different methods of conducting strikes, the different special forces operations, the special weapons, the detection rules, the use of helicopters and amphibious ships, and understanding how to deploy on the strategic map, understanding how to make trade-offs politically between provoking certain countries that are neutral or provoking an alliance. All of this comes together, and it could be described as a giant mixed game strategy with a huge probabilistic component, a stochastic element which we can only understand intuitively because it's so complicated. So here follow the rules. The advanced sequence of play. The first step is to determine the weather. On the first turn, this will be chosen by the initiative player. And then there's the initiative phase where it's determined which side has the initiative. And this matters because there are different sequences depending on whether it's an initiative turn or not. In the extended scenario that's being played here, it's 25 victory points. If one side has achieved 25 victory points, it then has the initiative. On a turn in which neither side has hit the 25 victory point requirement, then it's a contested turn, and it's essentially played with a non-initiative sequence. And in the subsequent turn after that, the player with the highest number of victory points that were acquired in that turn then becomes the first player, or rather becomes the initiative player for the next turn. And the first player of any turn was the initiative player of the previous turn. Next is the electronic detection phase. Both Russia and NATO have 6 attempts to detect headquarters units, which otherwise are not visible to aerial reconnaissance. Then there's the first special operations forces phase, which allows the initiative player to have basically an earlier effect of their special forces operations. Then there's the air-naval phase, which consists in part of calculating which aircraft are taken out of the ready box and into the flown box because of destroyed or captured or damaged air bases. Then there's the air superiority combat resolution phase, followed by determining the AWACS advantage, determining the air superiority level. Then there is the naval phase, in which control is checked for all of the strategic ocean areas, as well as rolling for mine clearance. Then there is the second Special Operations Forces phase, and if it's a contested turn, both players would conduct their Special Operations Forces operations at this time. Then there's the first strike phase, which is a long sequence, and is essentially compacting the use of all the aircraft, helicopters, headquarters strikes, the Wild Weasel attacks on the detection and SAM tracks, the nuclear weapons attacks, the cruise missile attacks, the missile attacks, and the artillery strikes. And at the very bottom is the aerial mining mission. And it's a strict sequence that must be followed. There's certain advantages to the Allied side, the NATO side, because they're slightly more organized. And so this is how you resolve the strikes. Then there's the first supply phase, which does not apply on game turn 1, and it's essentially to detect, or rather determine which unit is in supply and which unit is not, and as well to make transformations that convert supply depots into mobile supply units into supply depots, and the creation of mobile supply units and supply depots on urban areas and other supply sources. Then there's the initiative movement and combat phase. This is only in the initiative turn, and here I've highlighted it in pink. And essentially it starts with a movement phase by the initiative player. There's a combat segment. Then the defending player has elite reaction movement, and those are units with efficiency ratings of 6 or higher, which is quite rare, so that's not all units that can do that don't have a strike marker and are not out of supply, and they're not in an enemy zone of control. They can move up to their full movement allowance. In effect, they're doing a sort of a reserve reaction to plug holes and to bolster hexes that are being attacked by an opponent. Then there's the exploitation movement segment, followed by a combat segment. This is the breakout by the initiative player. These attacks are at -2 columns, which means they're less organized, and it's meant to represent the chaotic but important breakout role conducted by armored and other units. Then you've got the reaction movement segment, followed by a reaction combat segment, and so in effect it's a counterattack by the defending forces. You've got a second strike phase, which occurs only during the initiative player turn. Now, aircraft cannot fly more than once per game turn, in effect. But if you have multiple aircraft, you could have aircraft fly at different times. And sometimes it's important to have a second strike phase because you want to strike units that are blocking your exploitation. There's a second supply phase to determine which units are in supply and which are not in supply. And then there's the basic movement and combat phase, and this is conducted in addition to the earlier initiative movement combat phase. So it's not separate; it's in addition to. So in this instance, there's another movement segment and another combat segment by the attacker, followed by another reaction movement segment and another reaction combat segment. So if there was no initiative turn, this would be the only combat done for the contested turn. Then there's the isolation and surrender phase to determine which units cannot trace a line of any length back to a friendly supply source. Here's the reorganization phase. Here aircraft are flown back to their bases, helicopters are returned to their no mission, so it's essentially resetting the game for the next turn. Clearance operations are conducted at this time, chemical markers are removed, detection markers are removed, and you have the all strike marker 2s are reduced to strike marker 1, strike marker 1s are removed. Then there's the replacement and reinforcement phase. Replacements are essentially step level personnel that are added to units that have step losses, and new units are received in areas that are designated for that purpose. Then there's victory determination. This is important to see if there's a large enough differential between the victory points of the two players to see if there's a roll for automatic victory. As well, the victory points are used to determine in the next turn which players got the initiative turn, and then you advance the game record marker. This is Next War Air Superiority Combat Resolution Procedure. First, the individual pieces. These represent aircraft. The number on the top left is the all-weather indicator. Some aircraft on the top left also have an S, which indicates stealth, which gives benefits in combat. The number on the top right is the range, because there are restrictions as how far aircraft can fly and conduct combat. The 3 digits from left to right are air-to-air, close air support, and strike. If it's indicated by a single asterisk, it means that the aircraft can conduct standoff operations, whether air-to-air or air-to-ground. And if there's a double asterisk, it means it can conduct long-range warfare and air-to-air combat. Aircraft which have parentheses around the air-to-air combat value mean they cannot conduct offensive air attacks. However, this value is used to calculate their defense. Some aircraft, particularly American, have WW, which indicates wild weasel, and these aircraft have special capabilities against air defense systems, including SAMs and detection systems. The mid-right number is the pilot skill, with -2 being the best possible value and +2 being the worst possible value. These aircraft are deployed initially in the air box, and they're typically divided between ready, flown, and aborted. When an aircraft is aborted in combat, it's placed in the aborted box. When an aircraft has completed its mission, it's put into the flown box. And aircraft that are deployed on air superiority missions are deployed into this box here. Some boxes have recovery sections. This is for aircraft deployed in the US, and it's meant to abstractly indicate that US aircraft take a longer time to re-equip and refuel because of the great distances they have to cover. In this particular next war series, you've got the different airfields divided between Russia and Belarus, and these indicate the different airfields, and here you've got nuclear weapons facilities, and here you've got the permanent air defense values that'll be discussed in a different video. And here you can see the NATO holding box. In this particular example, we've got the Polish Air Force, the US Marine Corps, the US Air Force, US Navy, US Air Force, and then we've got the Russian Air Force and the Belarusian Air Force. So important values that determine combat are the weather track, what kind of weather it is, which is determined from a roll based upon which season it is. In this instance, it's summer-fall, and it's clear weather. Here we have also the AWACS Advantage and the current air superiority. The AWACS Advantage indicates how many aircraft can be placed. It gives essentially superior command and control to the state that possesses it. In this instance, these are Russian colors, so it indicates that the Russians have the AWACS Advantage. And this here is the current air superiority measure, which is a function of the combat we're about to do. So essentially, the first step is each side covertly chooses which aircraft are going to be deployed. Now there's some limits. These aircraft are not good for air superiority, and so they will not be deployed at all into the air superiority mission box. These aircraft carriers, at the moment, this one here is in the North Sea, and only aircraft with long range can participate. So here there's an L. So this F-35 is able to participate in this operation. This carrier here is deployed in the Baltic Sea, so both may participate. So these aircraft will simply be put here covertly. It'll be done simultaneously by both sides. The entire Polish Air Force will be deployed. The Wild Weasel will not. And even though the US Marine Corps AV-8B is not suited to the task, through desperation, it is also deployed. Now, the Russians choose not to deploy their bombers. They'll use them at a later date, but they deploy their Belarus allies aircraft and the Russian aircraft. And these are also destroyed, rather deployed. Now it's necessary to line up the aircraft against each other, and this is done in reference to the AWACS advantage. Now, an AWACS advantage of 1 indicates that the Russians begin by allocating the aircraft, and it proceeds along in a 2-to-1 ratio. So the Russians, for example, would take their 2 aircraft here and would arrange for them to be in combat with the 2 American stealth aircraft here. So these aircraft are now engaged in combat against each other. And then the NATO player chooses a target. The NATO player puts the AV-8B against the Sukhoi 30. Then the Russians have 2 more choices. They put the Belarusian, the Russian aircraft against another United States Navy aircraft and an F-16. And now there are extra aircraft left over, and these are deployed by the Polish player where they wish. You may never have more than 2 aircraft operating against a single aircraft in an air-to-air operation. So what we're going to do now is resolve the combat between different aircraft. And so we're going to begin here with the F-35 opposed to the MiG-31 and the F-16. And to resolve this, we're going to have to make use of the advanced air combat chart. X indicates a aircraft unit completely destroyed. DA indicates 1 step is damaged, and the remaining aircraft, if it is a 2-step unit, it would be reduced to 1 step and it would then abort. A means return to the abort box. AD advantage means that the aircraft would fight again the other aircraft, but it would fire first, and the other aircraft would fire second. D is a step loss, and these dashes are no effect. Here are the die roll modifiers. And this is an important reminder: stealth aircraft can't be engaged by long range or standoff fire. Essentially, if you want to kill one, you need to get up close and survive 3 steps of combat. So in air-to-air combat, there are 3 range steps that aircraft have to go through. And these values here are versus transports and paradrops, and these here are against aircraft. Now the AD result applies instead of D over here during long range and standoff attacks. So this result gives the firing unit advantage first shot in the ensuing standoff or dogfight combat. You'd normally rotate the unit 180 degrees to show that it's being chased if it's lost the advantage to the other aircraft. So let's resolve this first combat here. The attacker, in this case the MiG-31, can only attack one of these other 2 targets. It cannot attack the F-35C because the F-35C is a stealth aircraft, so the MiG-31 is going to attack the F-16. So what's done is a comparison is made between the air values, and here there's a 3 minus 4 because the poles have a 4 value, and so that results in a -1 column, which is this column over here. And the modifiers are then applied, and the only modifier for long range is +3 storm, because this is a fairly automated long range type of operations. So let's assume that a 3 was rolled, and so the result would be and rather than a target being damaged with 1 step loss, because this is long range and standoff, this gives the advantage in the next round of combat. So the Polish unit would be turned around like this to indicate that next round, if the MiG-31 attacked the Polish F-16, it would have a first shot. Now the Poles and the American naval F-35 is going to attack the MiG-31. Now the F-16, it's noted, has only 1 asterisk, so it may not participate in long-range combat. The F-35 has 2 asterisks, just like the MiG-31, and therefore it can. So we compare the value 4, 2, 3 for the F-35 and the MiG-31, and we get a column of +1, which is this column over here. And here we refer to the standoff die roll modifiers. If an aircraft with its attack value in parentheses would be attacked, it'd be a -1. Here we have a +1 if it's a non-NATO, Japan, Russia, or Chinese country. That means it doesn't have the technology to do this very well. This is a strike aircraft that are firing, and whether there's a storm. So again, there are no additional modifiers. So we would refer to this +1 column, and let's say we rolled a 1 or 2. The MiG-31 would be flipped over to its weaker side, and then the remainder of the step would be aborted. If a 3 or 4 was rolled, it would be aborted. If a 5 or 6 was rolled, because this is at standoff range, there wouldn't be a D for a step loss, it would be AD for advantage. So the F-35 inflicts an advantage roll. So the Russian aircraft should have been like that, but the MiG-31 is in fact turned this way. The F-16 keeps that position. So that is rather that's the conclusion for, we should not have been referring here. We should have been referring here to the long range combat. But if essentially there's the same lack of modifiers, because none of these modifiers were applied. And so that's the end of long range aerial exchange. Now we go to the standoff range. Now in the standoff range, if you recall, the MiG-31 has an advantage over the F-16. The F-35 has an advantage over the MiG-31, but because the F-16 couldn't shoot anyway, the F-35 will fire at the MiG-31, and if the MiG-31 survives, it'll fire at the F-16, and the F-16 will not fire at all. So here we're at the closer range. Again, we can see that there's no modifiers, different from the previous. So you have the F-35 to the MiG-31, the +1 column. Let's suppose another 6 is rolled, so the advantage is preserved. So the F-35 doesn't do any damage to the MiG-31. It can attack it again in next round when we get to dogfighting range or short range. Now the MiG-31 attacks the F-16. Again, we compare the 4 to the 3. There's a -1 for the Russian column. Let's say the Russians do the best possible roll, which is a roll of 0. That would result in the Polish air unit being damaged and flipped over to its side and then aborted. So it would be relocated here to be dealt with later. And so that concludes the standoff range. Now we proceed to the dogfighting range. So it's an advantage that goes to the F-35. It gets to shoot first. So here we have a ratio of, not a ratio rather, but a differential of 1 for the F-35, 4 to 3. So it's up on the +1 column here. Now for dogfighting, we compare pilot skill as a die roll modifier. Here the Russian pilot skill is 0 and the American pilot skill is -2, which gives a -2 for the American pilot. Yeah, so you only apply, these are monetically applied, so it's just the American -2 that's applied. It's not against a bomber, this doesn't apply. It's not a strike aircraft firing, there's no overcast, so simply the pilot skill. So the Americans would roll on this +1, and if they were to have rolled a 3, that would have been reduced down to a 1, and there'd be a damage, and then the MiG-31 would be aborted. If the Americans had rolled an 8, that would have been reduced down to a 6, and in this instance, it's not the advantage result, but the D result. So the MiG-31 would have been damaged, but not aborted. So let's assume that was rolled. Okay, the advantage is gone, and now the Russian MiG-31 can attack the American aircraft. The value's been reduced, and the pilot skill's been reduced as well. You have to work out the differential now for the MiG-31, which is a differential of -2. And plus the Russian pilot skill is +1. So if the Russians were to roll the best possible roll of 0, it would be increased to 1. and that would give a result of a D. And so the American F-35 would be damaged, and the MiG-31 would be damaged. So that's basically the resolution of one tactical combat. This procedure would be done all the way down the line, recalling essentially that one aircraft can only attack one of the other two aircraft at each stage. Now, an important result of this is once the combat is done, in the original rules, the ratio of the number of surviving aircraft would be calculated, but in my house rules, it's actually the ratio of the surviving air factors. And so here we would, let's assume that nothing happens here, very unlikely, but assume it's the same number of aircraft remaining. The total Russian air factors would be 4 plus 3 plus 5, which is 12, plus 5 is 17. And the total NATO total is 7, 11, 17, 24, 31. 31 to 17 is, we consult here the current air superiority, so it would be 1.5 to 1, but greater than 1.5 to 1, but less than 3 to 1. So we would take the air superiority counter and put it on air advantage and make sure it's on its NATO side. And then this indicates that the AWACS advantage would shift in the direction of NATO by one level. So it would shift down to here where there's no NATO advantage. And this has other implications, particularly for aerial reconnaissance and the ability of the side with current air superiority to use reconnaissance aircraft to peer in and detect ground based forces like armored vehicles, and that I will elaborate later. In order to attack targets, ground targets must be detected. Certain locations, installations in particular, ports, airfields, air bases, are always detectable. There are other methods for detection. The first is auto-detection from air reconnaissance. If you have a determination of current air superiority, in the Next War Poland game, it states that this does not apply because of the prevalence of UAVs. But I'm completely unconvinced that low-level air defense, high-level air defense, camouflage, jamming, I think all of those are going to significantly degrade the UAVs, and I expect there to be significant attrition among unmanned aerial vehicles. The UAV advocates are significantly undervaluing the possibility of more sophisticated camouflage, camouflage that can resist some of the remote sensing techniques of the UAVs. Therefore, I'm reinstituting the rule that was applied in the Next War India, Pakistan, Taiwan, and Korea games, and that is that once a current air superiority has been determined, the hexes from air bases that do not have a strike 2 marker on them, those units that are located in flat, rough, or marsh, whether flat, are automatically detected, and if they're in a hex with a road, they become automatically detected. No depots, of course, could ever be detected this way, but if there is a contested air superiority situation, then it extends 6 hexes from all air bases. On the strategic map, there is full detection if you're in the same land area. In the if it's advantage, superiority, or supremacy, the side that does not have the advantage, superiority, or supremacy has no air recon detection, and that state which does has 15, 30, and then infinitely, respectively. And on the strategic map, superiority and supremacy allow air reconnaissance detection of all units in all the different parts of the strategic map. Now, there are other ways of conducting detection. There is Special Forces operations. They can detect a whole variety of units, and plus they're the only means by which supreme headquarters and supply depots can be detected. Also, any unit that's adjacent to another unit also has automatic detection. Now, units that cannot be detected by air reconnaissance are headquarters, artillery units, and supply depots. And finally, there's electronic detection, which uses a system on this chart here. In the next door Poland scenario, this is used to detect headquarters units, not supreme headquarters units, but formation headquarters units. There are 6 attempts per side. There's an AWACS Advantage modifier if it's 3 or 4 for one particular side. The D indicates a detection attempt, and bad weather can decrease the total number of attempts, 2 attempts per side. And so the headquarters, that is the target, has that level of detection. And those are the different means for conducting detection. The mechanics of an airstrike. In this segment, we presume that the U.S. Air Force has sent 2 B-2 bombers to conduct a strike. These are stealth aircraft. So they've gone through the normal detection procedure that we looked at before, the advanced detection chart. If there was an ED, these aircraft could be intercepted, then attacked. Remembering, of course, that they are stealth aircraft, so there's a modifier in combat against them. Or they're simply detected, in which case they're attacked with SAMs and as they approach a target. Now, because they have AAA, because rather they have a standoff asterisk on their strike value, which is 5, the rightmost value, they're immune to AAA. So in this instance, these aircraft get through the detection process. They're not detected. They're immune to AAA. So they just move on to their targets to conduct their attack. And there's going to be 2 separate attacks here, one against a ground unit and one against an airbase. So for that, we need to go to our advanced strike chart, which is right here. So in the advanced strike chart, the values that are of interest are, first of all, these are the die rolls that are made to determine if the attack is successful or not. These are the different values for the aircraft airstrikes. These are the values for Scud missiles. And the terrain of the target is what is used to determine the difficulty in intersection with the type of system that's being used. So in this case, we've got a B-2 bomber with a strike value of 5, and it's attacking into, in the first instance here, into clear terrain. In the second instance, we have here a town. So but it's also, that's also a clear hex. So we have marsh or flat with a value of 5 or 6. That's a fairly extreme value. And then we look at the modifiers. So -2 if the hex is overstacked, high mountains. If it's against, if it's targeted, in other words, the special forces have laid down some sort of lasing procedure to facilitate identification of the target. The pilot skill. Here the B2s have a pilot skill of -2. So they have that modifier. The SAM result, there's no SAM fire at all. If they are attacked by interceptors, which they were not. Any weather effects, there aren't any. If it's a standoff attack versus a leg unit. Now in this particular instance, this this Belarusian airborne unit is in fact a leg unit. So it's a -3, it's able to hide more effectively. Where at the top you've got the B2 unit striking an airbase. So there's a +3, -2 for the pilot skill, so a net +1 for the attack on the Russian infantry unit. And so we go here and look at the result of a roll. Let's say we roll a 5. From that we subtract, we add 1 to a 6. And if we go across to here, we'll notice that a 6 is a miss. Now imagine if it wasn't a 6, imagine they rolled the best possible roll, which is a 0 plus a 1. So the result would have been a 1. The result would have been an X. And that would have been a step loss for the unit. It would have been turned over and been damaged, and then the B2 would have flown home. Now against the air base, the attack is against an installation, which include ports as well. This particular air base is not hardened. So we look at the terrain of where the air base is located, and it's located in flat. So again, it's the same location here. And let's presume that again, a 1 is rolled, a 0 is rolled to a +1. That equals an X. And so the installation is destroyed. And in that instance, we would deploy a collateral damage marker, which looks like this. So the B2 flies home after having destroyed the facility, and at the appropriate phase, we would consult the collateral damage chart. And this chart tells us what assets are destroyed and lost on the airbase when it's destroyed. It also applies to airfields or against attack helicopters that are located in cities and urban areas. So this was an attack on an airbase. The result was an X, and then we roll. And let's say we were to roll the best possible roll of a 0. There's a +1 if it's a hardened airbase. These are not hardened. Then the best possible outcome would have been this. 1 air unit located anywhere on the air mission chart, whether it's in the ready box, the flown box, the aborted box, or the air superiority mission box, one of those air units that is selected by the enemy player, not the friendly player, suffers a step loss. If it doesn't have an asterisk, like the second loss, then the owner takes away that step point, and 1 Airmobile point is lost. So that's the best possible outcome for the attacker, and that's how to use the collateral damage table. This is a more advanced examination of the advanced strike table. So let's explore some of it. These numbers, the numerical values, are associated with the strike values of aircraft and helicopters conducting airstrikes. The SUP headquarters, these are missile strikes that come from the Supreme headquarters. Headquarters and artillery refer to non-American headquarters and artillery strikes, typically missile strikes. Here you can see a Helo 2 conducting a missile strike. It's quite strong. Here's a Helo 2, Helo 2, Helo 2, and Helo 2. Here's a Helo 1, a Helo 1, a Helo 1, a Helo 1. Here are Scud missiles in the different terrain types. Here are the Scud missiles as well, and cruise missiles in the different terrain types. Here you can see the air defense track, hardened units, which include ports, and naval units. Here you can see the 3 naval values for the support value of the ships and the attack value of naval aircraft. So let's take a look at some of the modifiers. So die roll modifiers. If the target hex is overstacked, there's a -2, makes it easier to hit. If the target is in high mountains, there's a -2. A -1 or a -2 depending on the targeting done by the special forces. Because of Russian submunitions in violation of the Ottawa Treaty, the Russian multiple rocket launch systems have a -1, which is good. Pilot skill in airstrikes does matter. The SAM and AAA result acts as a value that reduces the effectiveness of the aircraft attack by keeping them at their distance. An AH-1 Wild Weasel has a +1. And you'll also notice the Wild Weasel attacks here. And these are attacks that are done against the SAM sites and against the air defense grid. This is a non-US cruise missile strike. So it's actually not very good. It's a bad quality. If the striking headquarters is reduced strength, if the attack is done against a bridge, bridges are hard to destroy. If the unit was attacked by interceptors, unit might have lost some of its ordnance. +2 if it's a theater weapon busting strike mission. In other words, attacking Scud missiles or cruise missiles might be difficult because they might be in bunkers. +2 for all airstrikes in overcast weather. +3 if there's an attack on the AAA track. And this is essentially reflecting that there's so many AAA components, it takes a huge effort and a low probability of reducing the effectiveness of AAA. Air or headquarters strikes in a storm turn. So if there's a storm, the artillery is going to be, of course, pushed around by the wind. +3 if there's a standoff attack against leg units. Leg units hide well. Standoff doesn't involve great visibility. So it's better to send in aircraft that are not standoff, like the A-10. When operating against naval craft, and this is in addition to the modifiers above, there's a -1 if it's a naval air unit conducting a strike. So naval air units have an advantage. A -1 for point detection. So that's the benefit of having a precise information on the location of a unit. -1 if the air unit is not doing a standoff strike when it's going against the ship. Of course, it's very dangerous because the ship will shoot at it. +1 for a cruise missile fired against a ship. And these are the assorted hardened targets. Supreme headquarters, supply depots, beachheads, ports. But ports are hardened only for cruise missile and Scud attacks only. Scud and chemical weapons points. Advanced interdiction. This is the use of aircraft to inflict movement point penalties on territory so that ground units, when they move through hexes, have to pay additional amounts. And it's indicated with a 1 interdiction marker and a 2 interdiction marker. Here's the chart. You find the intersection of the terrain, the intersection of the value of the aircraft conducting the interdiction. You apply the modifiers, including pilot skill. If it's an attack helicopter, because helicopters can also do this type of attack, which basically consists of blowing up bridges, blowing up culverts, blowing up other parts of the terrain that would collapse the road. +2 if the unit was attacked by interceptors. +3 if standoff weapons are used, because it's usually good to see the target that you're interdicting on the ground rather than taking long-range shots with laser-guided weapons. And the result is the level of the interdiction, which is then placed onto the hex. In addition, all roads in the hex become completely unusable. Ground movement. First, the individual units. This is a ground combat unit. 2 indicates the number of stacking points. 6 the attack value. 4 the defense value. 6 is the movement points, with the code referring to the type of movement. This is a headquarters unit. Here you can see the stacking of 1. This is both the range and the strength of its support. It's how many hexes away can provide support and the value of that support. 2 is the defense value. 5 is the movement point value. And this being a headquarters, it's important because it provides various capabilities that will support the ground forces. But this is the essential unit that does the fighting. Notice that the headquarters has got a value of 0. There may be 4 stacking points worth of units in a hex, unless that hex is a mountain. But in this particular environment that you see, there is no territory that's limited to 3 stacking points. The movement is facilitated by this chart, the movement chart, which distinguishes between the different types of mobility units. There's leg, light infantry, motorized, and mechanized. That's basically truck, tracks, specialized light infantry, and those that walk. The movement point costs are distinguished between storm and non-storm turns. And here's a wide range of territory types. Some which specify where zones of control don't penetrate into the hex, such as mountain, high mountain, and urban. Different kinds of road systems, secondary, primary, and highway. There's the effects of enemy zones of control. Effectively, it costs 1 point to exit or enter an enemy zone of control if there's no friendly unit already present. Factories, tunnels, towns, airfields, nuclear sites, and other air bases. And you can see the value of the points that are deducted from the movement points of the unit for them to be able to move. Now, with regard to the stacking, individual divisions may stack on a hex, even if they exceed the 4 stacking point limit. Furthermore, the overstacking is permitted, but for every point of overstacking, there's a reduction in the efficiency rating of the unit, which is the final value that I didn't mention before, which is a general measure of the efficiency of the unit. So let's see if we can't move these units closer, these Belarusian units, to approach and attack these French NATO units. So for this road type, this is a primary road. Its cost to this type of unit, if we look at a headquarters unit, it's the equivalent of a leg mobile unit. This unit costs half to move along a road. So we're going to move this unit second, this headquarters unit, because it's more important where the frontline units emerge. We've also got an artillery unit in there, which is motorized. But in fact, actually, you can see the headquarters unit here. It's in fact not leg mobile, it's motorized. And we can see it from the color code on the unit to the color on the movement chart. So it's a motorized movement. There we go. So let's get this division of Belarusian forces down the road. Units may not use the road for movement if the hex is stacked in excess of 4 stacking points, unless it's a singular division stacked together with no other units. So this first unit, it would be half here, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, and then 4 because it's going into a zone of control. And we could have it across the minor river here. And the minor river costs an additional point. 4, 5 to cross the river. 6 to go into this hex. 7 to leave a zone of control, this unit zone of control. And 8 to enter this zone of control. The other unit can simply move down and arrive here, following essentially the same path. It's got the same movement points. And then we can bring in the artillery here, which is also motorized movement, which is 6. It's down the same path. We can move it here. And we can move the headquarters to this location. The artillery unit, like the headquarters unit, has a support range, which is 4, and so it's well within the 4 range. We have up here in Kaliningrad another Belarusian unit that we can bring down here, another Belarusian division. Again, we'll move the maneuver units first and the artillery and the headquarters later. Again, these have values of 8. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So So one maneuver unit will move here, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A second maneuver unit will move here. And the headquarters and the artillery unit can easily move in there. So this is an example of movement to contact with the enemy. Bypass movement is very simple. It allows a ground unit to pass through a hex with an installation or a city without having to enter that city or pay the movement costs to enter that city. So in this instance, we have a brigade of mechanized Belarusians. They're going to move through Pashtek onto this hex over here. And in so doing, they pay the movement costs of the clear terrain in this hex, and they then deploy here. If there was an enemy unit inside Pashtek, the bypass movement would have been prohibited. Light infantry can be very useful in combat. Here you can see that they're indicated by a yellow squared movement point value, which you can see here on the movement chart. They have different movement costs for entering into different kinds of terrain. Here you can see the light infantry unit deployed on rough terrain and being surrounded by French units in flat woods and flat terrain in general. When light infantry unit is on non-flat or non-flat woods terrain, it ignores enemy zones of control that are being projected into that hex, as long as it's again not flat and not flat woods terrain. The exception, of course, is when it's using Airmobile, because then it's the Airmobile component, the helicopters, that are subject to the normal rules of zones of control. It does not have to stop when it enters a enemy zone of control. It can keep moving as long as it has sufficient movement points. Earlier I showed you an example of a Belarusian unit going from one enemy zone of control to another, and that is false. Only light infantry units can do that. All units must stop when they enter an enemy zone of control unless they are light infantry or unless they're Airmobile flying over enemy units. The light infantry do not have to pay extra movement points to enter or leave an enemy zone of control, even if they are the only unit there. They can move from zone of control to enemy zone of control as long as they have sufficient movement points. They're also free to move during the exploitation movement segment, even when beginning in an enemy zone of control. However, during all of this movement, they may not use road. Obviously, they're infiltrating, so they're staying off the local infrastructure. One of the functions of light infantry is to infiltrate, which is to use a kind of movement that allows them to penetrate around and through enemy units. So here, for example, this light unit can go through this hex and land in the rear of this hex. And this gives certainly an operational advantage, because you can cut off supply lines, you can cut off retreats. So this is how it's calculated. You have to identify the transit hex, and the final hex must be vacated, it must be empty. And then you look at the terrain of the hex through which the infiltration is going to occur. This here is flat woods, and we then consult the chart. Here's the light infantry infiltration chart. There's a modifier for -2 if there's mountains, highlands, or highland woods. -1 for the weather. +1 if there's a fortification, since they're designed to stop infiltration. And there's +2 for flat or rough terrain. This terrain here is flat, so there's going to be a +2. So it's a risky operation, but what needs to be rolled is a value higher. It's necessary to roll less than or equal to the efficiency rating. So in this case, you'd have to roll a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 0. But because of the +2 for flat terrain, which is in this hex, it'd be necessary to roll 3, 2, 1, or 0. So there's a 40% chance of success. Now, if there is failure, and the value is equal to or 1 greater than the efficiency rating, then there's a strike 1, a modified efficiency rating. So in this instance, if the number rolled was 3, was rather 4, then the strike 1 marker would be put on top of the mobile unit, and it would stay in the hex it came from. And if it was any value greater, 2 or greater, in other words 5, 6, 7, or any other value, it would be a strike 2 marker. Air mobile movement. Any light leg mobile unit which is indicated by a yellow movement number can use air mobile movement. Air mobile movement is essentially helicopter movement. Some units have the helicopters intrinsic to the unit and it's indicated by a 24 on their piece. The Belarusian airborne unit here, which is eligible for air mobile movement, does not have intrinsic helicopter capability. Air mobile points are provided to the different sides and are kept track of. For each air mobile point, it can carry 1 step level of units. And here you can see the Belarusian airborne brigade has a single step. The essential procedure is to start at an airbase and to count 24 total hexes. So if the unit started at the airbase, then you'd count from the airbase. And even if it didn't, you could count to the unit to pick it up and then to carry it to another location. So it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then the unit would be dropped. Now, there are instances in which air defense fire may or may not occur. If the operation occurred within friendly territory, the mission succeeds automatically. It is not intercepted. If it occurs in enemy territory, which is the instance in this case, or within 2 hexes of an enemy headquarters in friendly territory, then you'd resolve local detection and local SAM fire only, not AAA. However, if you do an air mobile operation and it comes within 2 hexes of an enemy ground unit or an installation controlled by the enemy, either originally theirs or captured and repaired later on, then local AAA is also affected if the air mobile movement was detected. If the air mobile unit began in an enemy zone of control or ends in an enemy zone of control, there is an additional air defense fire role. Now, if you look at the air defense fire chart, this is it. This here at the bottom is the part that pertains to the air mobile mission. An X indicates that there's a step loss to the flying unit and an air mobile point is permanently lost. An A indicates that the unit has to go back to its starting hex and the air mobile point is considered used, and a +1 and a +2 is also an abort to the operation. Other units which possess air mobile capability are amphibious ships. In this case, there's a 1 point here for air mobile operations. It indicates that the amphibious ship can transport by helicopter one stacking point worth of units. Here there's 2 half stacking points worth of units, and it can transport them 24 hexes. So it could pick up these 2 units and fly them around and land them here behind the Belarusian units. In this instance, because they're both landing in an enemy zone of control, they would be subject to 2 air defense fire procedures, just to indicate that it's much more likely that they would be damaged. Air mobile operations may not occur during the elite reaction movement. Now, if an air mobile point is lost while these marine units are flying, in fact, there is no loss recorded against the amphibious craft. It retains its mobile points. Air mobile units may not land on an urban city or installation, but if they land next to an installation, they may, and they're not in a zone of control, they may immediately occupy it. So in this instance, if this marine unit landed here, it could then take over this, let's imagine, hostile, unfriendly city and be put under a clearing marker. Although it's not recommended, air mobile, amphibious, and airborne troops that conduct a clearing operation immediately after landing suffer a penalty. Now, air mobile may not land in highland woods, or mountain unless there's a road there. So in effect, they can land almost anywhere except a hex with urban city or an installation at that location. Now, air mobile operations may also be escorted. escorted with defense suppression. So an airmobile operation may have an accompanying helicopter unit that would suppress enemy air defense. And the Marines have a capability. One of their helicopters functions as a wild weasel suppressing enemy defense. Now, what's the purpose of airmobile operations? It's very useful to capture distant territory. So the Russians could use it in order to secure islands that are in the Baltic. It's very useful for flying over and around enemy forces and isolating their logistics network, or capturing territory such as bridges or strategic urban areas in the rear of the opponent. Paradrop operations. An airborne unit, and in the scenario it specifies which units are airborne and which are not airborne, must trace a path of any length from an airbase or an airfield not in an enemy zone of control. If it survives air defense fire, it is then dropped. They cannot be dropped in urban areas, a hex containing a city, mountains or high mountains, highlands or highland woods, but just about any other terrain, including woods or clear, even a marsh. They also may not land in enemy territory that contains an installation. But what they can do is they can land, and then they can immediately move into a hex. If they're not an enemy zone of control when they land, they can move into a hex with a city, urban, or an installation, and then they would come under a clearing marker, as is sort of shown here in the upper left corner. It's moved on to the airbase and the city, and it's going to try to clear it. Although it's not recommended because the unit is woefully under strength for a successful clearing operation. And if it fails, the unit that's doing the clearing is going to suffer a step loss. So there are modifiers on the paradrop table depending on the type of train being dropped into. The slash on the left should be ignored. That's for the basic game. The modifier is a +1 if in an enemy zone of control. And the value we're interested in is on the right side of the slash. And S1 indicates 1 strike is inflicted, and S2 indicates 2 strikes are inflicted. The unit is considered in supply for the turn that it lands. Air transport. Any unit which starts in an airfield or an airbase or a strategic land area can be flown from one airbase to another airbase or airfield or strategic land area as long as the hex of origin or the area of origin and the destination is not in an enemy zone of control. On landing, the unit may use half of its movement point rounded up after landing. Leg units are eligible for this type of transport. Now, air defense is largely a function of who controls the skies. So for an air transport mission, if it's over enemy territory, then it uses the normal air defense procedure. If it passes over friendly territory within 2 hexes of an enemy headquarters, it depends who controls the airspace. So a reference has to be made to the advanced game air defense resolution table, which was referred to earlier. Now, the purpose of it is to rapidly relocate units to other sides of the map. And so it's, if there is air defense superiority, then it's a very efficient way to move light troops around the territory. However, typically sides have a limit as to the number of air points that can be transported in any given turn. Amphibious warfare. Units may embark on an amphibious craft if it's the same nationality and they are marine units in a port. Either the amphibious craft may move and then dock at the port for embarkation, or it may begin at the port, have embarkation, and then move to the location where it seeks to do the amphibious assault. For an amphibious assault to occur, the amphibious unit must have with it the assaulting land units. It must be done in an inshore box, which is either friendly or contested, and contains no enemy naval craft. So here we've moved the naval craft with the embarked amphibious unit to a all-sea hex adjacent to a beach. A beach is any flat or wooded flat coastal area that is not urban. It may be occupied or it may not be occupied. In the subsequent assault phase, the amphibious craft would then disgorge those that would attack the beach, the assault units. Those assault units may occupy an empty beach, or they may be used to attack an occupied beach. In that event, their attack values are totaled and then halved, rounded up for the combat. If the majority of the combat strength comes from the amphibious assaulting units after close support and other units contribute, then there's an additional shift of one column to the left on the odds chart, which does not benefit the assaulting Marines. Now an attack is conducted, and in this the amphibious craft can include its close support value. As well, the amphibious craft can use its heliborne capability to fly some assets in an airmobile fashion. So when the attack occurs, either the enemy is vacated off the beach, but if that is not achieved, then in addition to normal losses, the amphibious units suffer an additional step loss and they remain on their amphibious craft. Whether the Marines take an empty hex or whether they are able to push away a unit that was on the beach, they can then place a beachhead marker on the beach. What the beachhead marker does is it increases the stacking to 6. It allows those occupants on the hex to attempt to ignore retreat results. It is a supply source. And it allows the transport, what's called sea transport, of marine armor or leg type infantry units to the beachhead. In effect, units at other ports that are Marines, this is not a Marine unit, but if it was a Marine unit, they would be able to arrive and be deployed at the beachhead. Now the beachhead is removed if ever the amphibious unit relocates somewhere differently, or it suffers a step loss. And it can be used in combat. It has an efficiency rating of 4, 0 when it's unsupplied. And if it were to take a step loss, it would be removed and it would return 2 turns later. So this is the essential procedure for the amphibious attack. Sea transport. Any ground unit of any type, including helicopters, which are counted as half stacking points, may be moved from one port to another port. If both ports are controlled and friendly. The sea transport may, however, require a contested sea movement role, and that'll be specified later. No port may unload more than 2 stacking points worth of units per turn. Again, as with air transport, it's a very efficient way of relocating units. And unlike air transport, sea transport can relocate heavy units like armor and artillery. Headquarters. Certain headquarters are color-coded, and that allows an indication of the subordinate units to that formation. Others, such as the American headquarters in the U.S. Army, can command any brigade or battalion within the U.S. Army. And the Russians have a white headquarters with a white unit symbol, which indicates that different Russian headquarters can seamlessly command different Russian brigades and battalions in the Russian army. Headquarters have different capabilities. First and foremost, units may trace a supply line of 4 motorized hexes to the headquarters for supply, and then the headquarters would then trace to a supply source, a distance that's associated with that supply source. In addition to that, headquarters have certain capabilities. They have a support strength, which is the number 5 indicated here. The 0 indicates they cannot attack. The 2 is their defense value, and the 1 is their stacking point. But the 5 indicates that they can add 5 points to an attack or to a defense within that same range, within 5 hexes. A maximum of 2 headquarters may provide their support strength in an attack, and a maximum of 1 in the defense. In addition to that, headquarters may conduct strikes. Essentially, they're using their organic missiles capability, and if you were to look at the strike chart, you would see that the headquarters are indicated. There's headquarters in artillery, there's U.S. headquarters, which have the MLRS, and so headquarters can conduct a strike. When they use the strike capability, the headquarters would have to be rotated 90 degrees to indicate that one of their critical capabilities has been used. And they may conduct a maximum of 1 strike per turn against a ground unit. There's a +1 die roll modifier if the headquarters had taken a step loss in combat to indicate that its efficiency has been reduced. They may also conduct interdiction strikes, which is to put strike markers on the map and increase the penalty in terms of movement points to move through that hex. Headquarters, if they're in supply, also provide a -1 die roll modifier to air defense against enemy units landing, such as Airmobile or airborne, or performing a mission within 2 hexes of the headquarters. There's also a more general rule that as the headquarters advances, it brings with it the normal air defense fire capability, as opposed to the local air defense fire capability. So it's as if the country's national air defense system is advancing with the headquarters. Headquarters may also deploy chemical weapons markers, which are important for, in this particular simulation, the Russian and Belarusian player. The units must be within range of the headquarters to benefit from the application of the chemical weapons marker. This marker reduces the efficiency of opponents by 3, but only 2 if the defenders are American. The headquarters may also build a bridge, as indicated here with the arrow pointing at the hex side. And these temporary bridges can be built in a hex side if there's no enemy on either side, or if there is an enemy on one of the sides, then it can be built if there's a friendly unit located in the hex, facing one of the sides of the hex side. The bridge then acts as a bridge, and there's no movement penalty to cross the particular hex side, which in this case is a major river. And the bridge is ultimately removed voluntarily, or if it's outside of the support range of the headquarters, or if an enemy unit ends its movement in the hex, or it's destroyed by an airstrike or a special operations force attack, or a nuclear weapon is detonated in one of the hexes on either of the sides. And so in the latter 3 cases, the bridge is permanently removed. We're now going to conduct combat, in which the Belarusians will conduct 2 separate attacks on the 2 French units. The first step is to bring in air support. If we refer to the earlier combat that we conducted, the defenders may bring in a maximum of 1 helicopter and 1 air unit for air support. The attacker may bring in a maximum of 2 helicopters and 2 air units. So in this particular instance, we're going to deploy a Tupolev 22 and a Sukhoi 24. and they're going to be escorted by aircraft that are available on the air superiority mission block here. So these units are going to be made available. So we're going to send out the a Sukhoi 30 and a Sukhoi 34 as escorts. Now the Defender may deploy maximum 1 close air support aircraft. So we're going to send the F-35C and the F-16 from Poland. And these will escort the F-16 from Poland as well. So we'll gather these pieces to the table here. And we're going to have 2 separate operations. So we have here a Polish attacker airstrike unit being escorted Okay, so when an air support operation is being conducted, there's a series of steps to go through, and those steps include first detecting the aircraft. And there's a detection chart, but before you look at the chart, we're going to refer to the air defense track. The Russians have a SAM value of 9, detection of 9. NATO's got a detection of 8 and a SAM of 8. Russia's got a AAA of 3, and NATO's got a AAA of 2. AAA does not work if the attacker is using a standoff close support capability, which none of the aircraft that are attacking currently have, although there are some aircraft that do it very well, like the Frogfoot and the A-10. So these aircraft will be subject to AAA. So step 1, and we'll do the attacks simultaneously. Well, rather, we'll go through the procedure simultaneously. This is the advanced detection chart, and let us start with an attempted detection of the Russian offensive airstrike. Okay, so NATO's got a detection capability of 8, and we have to refer here to the different modifiers. If we can see this well, here we go. So it's a -1 if the target is within 2 hexes of the same land area as a detecting player's HQ. That doesn't apply because we're not in a land area. -1 if the attack helicopter or Airmobile movement passed through the detecting player's occupied hex or land. It doesn't apply. -1 if it's against an attack helicopter. Basically because attack helicopters. And +1 for Wild Weasel included in the mission. We did not include it. +1 if the mission hex is in the mountain or high mountain hex. +1 if the weather's overcast, or if there's a storm, or if the attackers are purely stealth units. So we refer here to NATO, and let's assume that NATO manages to roll a 3. We have early detection. Now, what this means is that an interception can actually be made with aircraft from the chart. So from the that are available in the air superiority mission block. So NATO's detected the Russian operation, and so we're going to deploy these 2 Polish aircraft to try to intercept the mission that the Russians are sending to bring support to the ground combat. So we've already seen how this combat is resolved previously, but there's some additional rules here. It starts at the greatest distance for combat, which is the long-range combat, just as we saw before. But neither aircraft here has got a double asterisk, so we move immediately to the standoff range, where combat's resolved. Now, the Polish units are interceptors, these 2 Russian units are escorts, and the 2 units that are conducting the airstrike are protected, because the Poles cannot attack the Belarusian bombers until they abort or destroy the escorts. So we presume in the standoff phase there's an engagement, and probably then again in the dogfight segment there's an engagement. The sides are evenly matched, so they probably inflict damage on each other, but it's very unlikely that they would have attacked the escorts. Now, if let's say one of the Russian units was aborted, then the Polish unit in the subsequent phase, if it chased off the Russian unit in the standoff segment of the fight, it can then engage it in the escorted Belarusian strike unit in the dogfight segment, and they could probably abort it as well. But let's assume that that doesn't happen, and the 2 Russian aircraft get through. The 2 Russian escorts are then put into the flown box. They finished their mission. And the 2 Polish units are also put into their flown box. If they were aborted, they would have been put into the aborted box. We then do the same with the units, the escorted Polish units. We consult here the chart, knowing that the Russians have a detection of 9. We go to the advanced detection chart. We have here a 9. Let's suppose that the Russians roll this number. Let's say they roll a 7. That's a detection. Now, when a detection occurs, it means that the airstrike that's coming in cannot be intercepted. It would have had to have been early detected, and so the 2 escorts are basically done because they cannot be fired at by surface-to-air missiles, and so they're basically deployed in the flown box. The American long-range unit goes back to its carrier, and the Polish unit goes back here. So these are the units that have made it through. Now they will conduct, both sides will conduct air defense to try to deal with the incoming threat. So we're going to deploy the units in their relevant locations. There's going to be 2 Russian units bombing this target and a Polish unit bombing this target. So for that, we consult the Advanced Air Defense Fire chart. Now, because both sets of aircraft were detected, they're going to be fired on as they fly in. If there was no detection, then AAA would be applied on their way out regardless. Now, the way to interpret this chart is X is a step loss, A is abort, +2 or +1. These are values deducted either from the aircraft strike, if it was conducting a strike, but in this instance it's not, it's simply conducting close air support, or it's deducted from its close air support value. So if you have a +2 and the aircraft's got a 2 air support value, this value's it's not really a plus. It's effectively deducted from their value. So the air defense is such that it makes the aircraft's intervention ineffective. So here are the modifiers for SAM fire, if it's within 2 hexes of a headquarters, because the headquarters provides SAM assistance. -1 against attack helicopters, +2 if there's a wild weasel in unit, +3 if it's a stealth unit. The last 3 don't apply. The first one does. It's being conducted. The Russian interception air defense is being against the Polish aircraft is being conducted within 2 hexes of a headquarters unit. As you can see here, the headquarters unit is right there next to the Polish unit. And these are modifiers for AAA. Again, nothing that applies here. These are modifiers for SAMs and AAA for different weather conditions. And these are the interpretation of the results, whether against helicopter and air units or against transport missions. Okay, so let's resolve that. So for the Polish unit, the Russians have a SAM of 9. There's a -1 to the roll because it's within 2 hexes of a headquarters unit. We would apply that. So assume a roll of 5. Which is modified to a rule of 4. And so if we look at the 4 row on a SAM of 9, that's an A or an abort. So this Polish aircraft is aborted, and it's then located into the abort box. We can then consult the, so there's no further calculation necessary for the AAA because the AAA, well, actually no, the AAA was 3 and had, look at the AAA, you have to roll AAA as well, had the roll been made a 0, then because the dice go from 0 to 9 and not a 10, then the unit would have also suffered a step loss. So presume we presume it isn't. We presume something else is rolled here, and it just sort of flies onto its abort box. So now we've got NATO. It's got a SAM capability of 8. It rolls a 5, and so what we see here rolls a 5 on an 8. There's a +2, and let's presume it rolls again. It rolls a 6 for a +1. So there's a +2 and a +1, and what effect that has is it takes this aircraft, the Sukhoi 24. It's got a support of 2, but there's a +2 rolled on the chart, and so the 2 cancels out. So this aircraft's capability is reduced to a 0. So effectively, the SAMs neutralize its contribution to the air battle. For the Tupolev 22, you have a 2 plus a 1. It reduces this down to a 1. So it has a 1-point modifier to the ground combat. So this aircraft's effectively useless. And then the AAA fire would be rolled because these aircraft are detected. And NATO's got a value of 2 for their AAA, and presumably, let's presume that the rolls are higher up here. And so the aircraft don't have negatives. So the Sukhoi 24 is effectively useless. Let's just put it off and put it into the flown box. It's not aborted. It completed its mission. It just didn't complete it very successfully. And now we can proceed and calculate the combat for the units that are here. We'd have to confirm that the units are supplied, of course. That we're going to discuss in another phase. Another support that I just that would occur at the same time is the helicopter support. Now the attacker can deploy a maximum of 2 helicopters and the defender 1. And helicopters fly closer to the ground. They're much more difficult to detect and intercept. And if they are intercepted, it's typically local, which means local units with their local missile defense can interfere with the aircraft's operation, but the rotary wing aircraft's operation, but you can't bring to bear the colossal surface-to-air missile systems because they can't distinguish the helicopter from the background clutter of whatever's on the ground. So helicopters are, in that sense, fairly stealthy, and they're very hard to hit. So if we presume that there's been a detection, say NATO's got a detection of 8. It's got to roll on the detection chart. We go back here to the advanced detection. Now remember, you roll for detection for the entire mission, but you roll to attack the individual aircraft. So for this helicopter, it's a 1 helicopter mission. There's a detection chart. So here, it's when attack helicopter passes through detecting player's occupied hex or land area, which it did. So it's entering into Poland. Against an attack helicopter is another -1. Yep, so there's a -2 there for helicopters. You'll see here are the AWACS advantages, which we didn't apply because no state had an AWACS advantage of 2 or greater. Right now the AWACS advantage is at 0, if you recall the previous operation. So a roll is made on the local detection with a -2. Let's presume that a 4 is rolled, -2. The Russian helicopter is detected. Therefore, NATO can roll with its AAA. And here we would refer to the local column and the local SAM. And again, we would consult to see the die roll modifiers for a SAM. If it's within 2 hexes of a headquarters, no, the French don't have a headquarters unit there. Did the helicopter fly over enemy units on the way to its target? In this case, it did not. For AAA, -1 for a helicopter. So they're easy to shoot down if you detect them. So the local SAM, let's suppose that a 6 is rolled. There'd be no effect from the local SAM. And for the local AAA, let's assume that a 3 is rolled. That's brought down to a -2. That's a +1. And the +1 counteracts the close air support value of the Mi-24, effectively rendering it to 0. So the Mi-24 flies home. Okay, the second value here is the movement point, so it's going to fly back to Kaliningrad the way it came, and because it's conducted one of its 2 permissible missions in a turn, it can do up to 1 per segment. We rotate it 90 degrees to remind us that it's expended one of its missions and not contributed much to the success of the battle. So now we do the ground attack, and we're going to do 2 separate ground attacks, one against the French inside Olsztyn, and one against the French armored unit here. And no, you know what? We're not going to do that. We're actually going to concentrate all available resources against this French unité blindée, so we could blow it up. So we're going to have 2 separate formations, this green northwest division from Belarus and the western blue division from Belarus. So we have 2 separate formations engaged in the combat with the support of a +1 from the Tupolev 22. So the chart we use for that is the combat results table, which is fairly large and complex, but essentially what we're getting from this table is the terrain type, a ratio that's rounded off in favor of the defender, and it's the ratio of the attack value to the defender value, the die roll modified, and the results here are the first number is the step losses suffered to the attacker. The slash to the right is the step losses suffered to the defender. And if an R appears, the unit must retreat. And it must retreat either 1 hex or possibly 2 hexes, depending on the type of terrain. And for that, we're going to look at the chart. Now, if there are ever excess combat losses, where more losses are suffered by a unit that it can bear, essentially it's wiped out, then the other unit can reduce its losses by 1. When these losses are inflicted, they must be inflicted as evenly as possible among the defenders, and no unit may be destroyed until all other target units in a hex have at least suffered 1 step loss. So it has to be evenly distributed before units begin to be eliminated. So here, first of all, are the column shifts for the efficiency rating. So each side will designate a lead unit that will conduct the attack, and those units will provide their efficiency. So typically you want to have the units with a high level of efficiency. But here the Belarusians have all the same efficiency of 5. The French have a 6. So the French are going to have a +1 column modifier to their favor. If there's an attack into a city, no, the attack is into a clear area. There's no surprise. Exploitation combat is sort of a second wave of attacks that occur in an initiative turn, and it basically represents disorganized breakthroughs that occur after the initial battle. It's typical with armored breakthroughs. If there's artillery brigade support, there is in fact 1. So there's a column shift for the artillery brigade for the Russians, a 1 column shift against the Belarusians. So this area here cancels itself out. Here we can look at other effects. All attacks across minor rivers and bridges are halved. So here we have 2 Belarusian units. They're attacking across a minor river to hit this unit. Their attack strength will be halved as a consequence. Armored advantages into non-fortified, non-forested, non-city, flat, or rough is ×2. So they have a bonus of armored movement across the plane. But they're not armor. If you look at the actual unit designation, these are all mechanized. So what they actually obtain is a 1.5 advantage, 1.5 times. Here are other modifiers. We haven't looked at isolated or out of supply. We'll discuss that later. So here's different die roll modifiers. There's a +1, or rather a -1 modifier for the attacker that comes from the Tupolev 22 that's providing support. These are the number of aircraft and helicopters that may participate in the attack. So other die roll modifiers. Attacking from 5 to 6 hexes, -2. No, it's not happening in this case. Attacking from 3 or 4 hexes. In fact, there are 3 separate attack hexes that are participating, so there's a -2 from that. Mountain infantry, there's no light infantry. Now, let's take a look at the odds here. Here we have half for the stream, but doubled because they're attacking into the clear. So, not doubled, rather 1.5. So, this is reduced to 1.5, or let's do it together. Easier to calculate. You've got 6 here. Drop down to 3 because they're attacking your house on Minor River, and then multiplied by 1.5, which is 4.5 plus 3 is 7.5. 7.5 to 6 is essentially 1 to 1 if you were to round it down in defense of the favor of the defender. And so that's a 1 to 1 odd, but there is an extra amount left over. So according to this chart, we apply another -1. So now it's a -1 for close air support, -1 for the 3 hexes, and -1 for the remainder. So that's a total of -3. There's nothing in the hex that is defending with. There is a multi-formation attack, so that's a +1. So the Russian advantage goes down to a -2. Yeah, so we basically have a -2 here. So let's imagine we roll the average roll of, say, 5, and that's going to be down to a 3. And we have to look at the train. The train is flat on a 1 to 1. So this is the what we're going to end up with here, 1 to 1, down to 1/2. So here the attacker suffers 1 step loss. And then the attacker suffers 1 step loss. And then the defender is annihilated because they suffer 2 step losses. And the aircraft then flies back to the flown box. And then what happens here is you advance after combat, advance after combat. Once a hex is vacated, especially if it's clear, the attackers can advance into the hex. And they may then advance a further hex, ignoring zones of control. And so in order to surround the French unit in this urban area, this unit would continue, this unit would cross over, and that's the conclusion of the attack. Retreating and advanced after combat. As a result of some combat results, occasionally there is an R, which indicates that the defender must take the losses, and in addition to that, conduct a retreat. The retreats are either 1 or 2 hexes. If the defender was in a non-city or non-fortified flat woods, rough woods, or marsh, it must retreat 2 hexes. Otherwise, it's required to retreat 1 hex. And the principle is it must be that far away from its original hex. So there's a priority listing for retreating units. First, this unit must, of course, it's not permitted to retreat into prohibited terrain. It would want to approach the closest friendly map edge, and those hexes should be free of enemy zones of control. Now, in this particular instance, let's say this unit was retreating. Here there's an enemy zone of control, and here there's an enemy zone of control. And so this unit has a bit of difficulty. It can't satisfy the first requirement. The second priority is to retreat along a path that's free of enemy zones of control. That is not attainable. The third priority is to move towards a friendly map edge. And then finally, it's to retreat anywhere where there's non-prohibited terrain. So it can satisfy priority 3. So let's say it's told to retreat, it's in clear, so it must retreat 2 hexes. So it'll retreat 1 and then 2. Now, it is not that simple. A unit can retreat through a friendly unit because that counters the enemy zone of control. So it could retreat here, and then it could retreat here because it'll allow it to avoid the enemy zones of control. Furthermore, this is an Airmobile unit with intrinsic Airmobile capability. It can actually retreat using its Airmobile capability, but because it began in an enemy zone of control, it would suffer an additional air defense fire effect as it was withdrawing. Now, units that retreat may not retreat across a river. Only light infantry may retreat across an unbridged river hex side. Units may not retreat if, of course, it puts them on the same hex as an opposing unit. Now, if a unit is retreating from a city or from an urban area, or highland woods, or highlands, or mountain, or high mountains, or fortifications, or hexes with cities, or beachheads, it can attempt to ignore the retreat. So it would need to roll equal to or less than its efficiency rating, and if it succeeds, then it doesn't have to retreat. If it fails, it then either retreats or it loses an additional step to whatever was lost in combat. Now, units may also stay in their hex if they're not able to retreat because they can't satisfy any of the priorities. For example, the unit is completely surrounded. In that instance, it could stay if it could make a efficiency an ER check, but again, if it fails, it suffers an additional step loss. Now, if there's multiple units in the hex, the calculation is made from the unit with the lowest efficiency rating value. And every time a unit retreats through an enemy zone of control, such as in this instance, it must roll again less than or equal to its efficiency rating, or it suffers an additional step loss. So in effect, there's a number of different instances where the ER check is applied. It's applied if a unit is in a location where it may voluntarily choose not to retreat. It may make an ER check to avoid suffering an additional step loss when it goes through an enemy zone of control. And it may make an additional an efficiency check if it can't retreat because it can't satisfy any of the priorities. Now, once the retreat is done, the attacker may conduct an advance after combat. Now, at least one unit that attacked must go into the hex that was attacked. Now, if the unit is mechanized or motorized, and it's not a storm turn, and the hex it's going into is not urban or city or has an installation, then it may move an additional hex. And the additional hex that it moves ignores enemy zones of control. So it could sort of drive on ahead. And other units may also enter a hex, but you can have no more than 4 stacking points advancing into a hex after combat. Clearing operations. In order to take possession of an urban area, a port, an airbase, or a strategic land area, the area must be cleared. To clear a land area, the first step is to advance into the hex, which in this case is being done by the victorious Belarusian units, and then to draw to draw a single clearing marker. And I'm going to show you here the two extreme values, the highest possible and the lowest possible value for the clearing markers, which are unknown until drawn. So those range between 3 and 6. And so let's run a scenario and clear that urban hex with both clearing markers. So let's start with the 3 number clearing marker. So the first step is to subtract from the efficiency rating of the unit, which in this case is a 5, which is indicated on the the right-hand middle side of the unit counter, which is a 5. So 5 minus 3 is going to be a 2. So if the efficiency rating is higher than the than the clearing number, then it becomes a positive value. If, for example, the 6 clearing marker would have been chosen, then it would have been 5 efficiency rating minus 6, and that would have been generated a negative value, negative minus 1. So a plus 2 for the 3 and a minus 1 for the 6. The next requirement to be satisfied is that the stacking limit of the units on the hex or in the area to be cleared is the minimum safe stacking point limit. And for this we consult a chart. It's the clearing operations chart, and you can see the strategic land area requires a stacking point minimum of 5. An urban area, which in this case is being cleared, is a 4, and there are 4 stacking points there in fact. 3 for a city, 2 for an installation or a strategic island land area. For every point below the minimum safe stacking point requirement, there is a -1 modifier, which makes it more difficult to clear an area. So ultimately, to clear the area, the player will want to roll higher than the clearing number with modifiers. The next modifier is a -1 for every additional installation in the hex. such as, for example, if you have a city, an urban area rather, that also contains a port or also contains an airbase. There's then a modifier for special assault if the unit that's occupied the urban area is an airmobile or amphibious or airborne, and they just landed next to it and then jumped into the city to take over. There's also a combined arms modifier. If you have infantry and armor or mechanized, and in this case there's mechanization, there's a +1 die roll modifier. So because the minimum safe stacking point requirement has been satisfied, which is 4 for the urban area, there's no modifier there. This urban area has got no additional facilities, so it's quite an easy process to calculate the result. If the 3 clearing counter had been selected, then there would be a +2 modifier, +1 because they're mechanized forces, for a total of +3. And so the player would then roll and have to roll a number +3 that is higher than 3 on the counter. In other words, if they roll a 0, then they fail. So there's a 10% chance of a failure of success. Now, if on the other hand there is a 6, then it'd be 6 minus the 5 efficiency rating, indicating a -1. That would be canceled out by the combined arms modifier. And because the minimum safe stacking point requirement's been satisfied for the urban area, which is 4 stacking points doing the clearing operation, there are no modifiers, and so the player would have to roll higher than a 6, a 7, 8, or 9, which indicates a 70% chance of failure in clearing the city. There are additional modifiers here. There's a -1 for clearing Lithuania or Estonia, because these are much larger areas, the strategic areas. There is a -1 for clearing the flagged areas, which are the capitals of Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the strategic areas. There's a -1 for clearing a city from an amphibious assault. In other words, if an amphibious assault was conducted on a beach hex and then the unit immediately moved adjacent into the city. Also, there's a -1 for clearing on the turn of a paradrop or an airmobile operation. And the rest of the modifiers have already been discussed. Supply is very important. Units that are not supplied have their attack value and their movement value reduced by half, and a unit, although it continues to have its normal defense. Supply sources include urban areas, depicted here in Kaliningrad, and if it's from a friendly country originally, and if you can trace 6 movement points of motorized, that is to say truck movement points, to the urban hex, then the unit is in supply. Another source of supply are depots. They have a supply range of 8 movement points. There are mobile supply units, which have a range of 4 movement points, and marine beachheads, which have a range of 4 movement points. Furthermore, in many of the games, if you can get to a map edge that's on a friendly side, you have a range to that map edge that also keeps units in supply. So this French unit, for example, is in supply because it's in an urban area. If it wasn't in an urban area, it would be out of supply because you cannot trace a supply line through hexes that are in enemy zones of control, which are the 6 hexes surrounding an enemy unit. So the essential philosophy is to use the mobile supply units, which have mobility, and the supply depots, which do not have mobility, to keep the attackers in supply. The depot can be built out of mobile supply units. And so here we have mobile supply units driving here. And they can be turned into, with the expenditure of supply points, into depots. And on top of the depot, we can then build later new mobile supply units, again, costing supply points. And so we have sort of a moving chain of supply. So even if Kaliningrad is no longer available, ultimately the supplies could be traced to the mobile supply unit or to the supply depot. Now the supply depot is difficult to detect. It's not automatically detected, and but if it is detected and it's destroyed, then it's difficult for the player to maintain supply. They have to then build another supply depot upon which they can build MSUs. So the supply depot should be thought of something that's continuously being built and stocked up and advanced with the forces as they move across the map. And they are, if they're detected, vulnerable to air and vulnerable to airmobile or airborne attacks or any attacks in the rear. So the supply line has to be garrisoned to some extent. The specific details of the prices for the mobile supply units and how to build them and how to build the depots are in the rules. And a further effect of being out of supply is the efficiency rating is reduced by 1. Emergency supply. Sometimes units are cut off, or sometimes you have airborne units or airmobile units that are deep inside enemy territory and they need to be resupplied and they don't have access to an airfield, so they're not being resupplied that way. So you can drop emergency supply. To do this, you have to consult the chart, and there's a choice. Either you apply 3 supply points to try to resupply headquarters, and consequently all of the units subordinate to the headquarters are resupplied, or you, and that costs 3 supply points, or you deploy 1 supply point per ground unit for a maximum of 3 supply points, and you have to roll for each of those individual units. Here's the chart. If a supply point, if an emergency supply attempt is made and it fails, all the supply points that were expended in the attempt, well, are expended. Combat on the strategic display. On the strategic display, there are no hexes, and so movement and combat have a different system. Movement from one strategic area to another by ground forces takes up the entire movement point allowance of the unit. So in this case, the units could have moved from Russia or Belarus into Riga. Once in a strategic land area, units must be stacked in stacks of stacking points of 4, and then they can conduct combat against each other. Artillery units and headquarters units that are not stacked with other combat units may not be attacked unless every other non-headquarters and non-artillery unit are engaged in combat. No more than 6 stacking points may attack a defending stack. So in this case, you've got 2 stacks of 4 each of mechanized units that are Belarusian. 4 of one stack and 2 of another stack can attack the 4 stacking point stack that is French. For the purposes of ground combat, the terrain is rough woods. Air combat, airstrikes can occur, air support can occur, special operations raids can occur, and it all uses the terrain of rough woods. The strike effects. So what are the effects of having strike 1, strike 2, and destroyed markers on installations and different types of ground units? First of all, there's a convenient chart, which is the strike effects table, which is on the back of one of the rule books. So let's take a look at the effects on each of the units. So focusing first on the ground units, which we can see over here, the strike 1 marker is going to inflict a -1 to the attack, defense, movement allowance, and the efficiency rating. So in other words, to all of the 4 values there on the unit. A strike 2 will reduce the attack, defense, movement allowance, and efficiency rating again by -2, but this time to a minimum of 1, so it can't reduce it to 0. Also, neither of these 2 units can move during the exploitation or elite reaction phase, so they're effectively immobilized if they're struck. Furthermore, these units could not use airborne, airmobile, or sea transport. In effect, the transport is disrupted. A destroyed marker or an X on the airstrike table would simply indicate that the unit would be flipped over and lose one of its steps, but any strike marker it had on it would be removed, and so the other effects don't apply. So this unit basically has no restrictions to its values, and it can move during the exploitation or elite reaction phase. Now the effects on artillery and headquarters is also cumulative. It's the same for the effect of ground units. So strike 1 will subtract 1 from the defense, the offense, the defense, the movement allowance, and the efficiency rating. A -2 will have a -2 effect for all of those. But in addition, a strike 1 marker will rotate the headquarters 90 degrees, so it loses one of its abilities. And a strike 2 marker will rotate it 180 degrees. Furthermore, the moment a unit is struck by a step loss marker, it loses an additional ability. So it would suffer a step loss. And if it already had a strike 1 marker, it would have a strike 2 marker, and it would be rotated at least 90 degrees, indicating that it lost at least one of its capabilities. Now, for a supply depot and mobile supply units, a strike 1 marker has no effect. If there were a strike 2 marker on it, then it could not then create a mobile supply unit. So it'd basically be static. And you could not extract supply points from it, and its supply range would be reduced down to 4 motorized movement points. If there was a destruction marker on it, then the depot would be destroyed. Now, for mobile supply units, represented here, they could not move in the initiative movement segments if they have a strike 1 marker. In effect, they're not going to help a fast offensive, and they move half of their basic movement point value, which is normally 4, so that would be reduced to 2. With a strike 2 marker, it would be the same effects as here. In other words, half movement point and not move in the initiative movement segment. As well, they cannot be flipped over to create a supply depot, and they cannot be removed for supply points. And furthermore, if there's a destruction marker, well, it's simply eliminated. Now, for installations, these apply to air bases as well as ports and airfields. And here we have an airfield, here we have a port, so you'd have to specify which is the target. It would reduce the port's capacity by 1 if there was a strike 1 marker. Normally, ports have a capacity of 2, unless indicated otherwise. Up here, we can see a port with a 1, suggesting that it has a 1 capacity. So focus back on the port with a strike 2 marker. The effect of that would be to reduce the port capacity to 2 and effectively making the port useless. Air bases and airfields could not be used for air transport, airborne movement, Airmobile movement, and attack helicopters could not rebase there. In effect, the airbase becomes not destroyed, but operationally useless. And now, if it was destroyed, if there's a destroyed marker, then if it was a port, victory points would be awarded. If it was an airbase or airfield, victory points would be awarded. Furthermore, attack helicopters couldn't go there. These facilities, however, can be repaired. And if it was an airbase, there would be collateral damage rules that would be needed to see what effect would occur on that particular unit. And there's other units that can be affected, which are beachheads, surface action groups, and aircraft carriers and amphibious units. For an amphibious unit, or rather for a beachhead, it's got a landing capacity in any given turn, which is here 4. And if it's got a strike 1 marker, it's reduced by 1. If, however, it's got a strike 2 marker on it, then it's flipped over to its no supply side, which means it's not able to provide supply. The landing capacity is reduced to 0. Yeah, so in this effect, that's sort of a cumulative effect. And if it's destroyed, it's taken off and put onto the turn track, and it appears 2 turns later. For a surface action group or an aircraft carrier, if it receives a strike 1 value or strike 1 damage, it can retreat to the nearest port or at-sea box. And this has to be, there's specific rules on how to do that. The same applies if it receives a strike 2 marker. And if it's destroyed, it's removed from the map and returned 4 turns later. Now, all of those naval effects on a SAG also apply to an amphibious unit, but in addition to that, any unit that the amphibious unit is carrying, typically Marines, if there's a 1 strike value, then the unit suffers a 1-step loss that's being carried. If there is a 2 strike, then 2-step losses, and if there's a 3 strike, there are 3 steps lost for the unit that's carrying it. So ground units are quite vulnerable when they're on board ships that are struck and suffer strike effects. Naval warfare. These are naval units. You can see SAG, surface action groups, and amphibious craft. These are the values on them. This here is the combat support value. It allows a unit to provide combat support to within the range here, which is the superscript on the right side, to within 1 hex. So this would be deployed on the hexagonal, what's called the all-sea map. Those are maps where you've got hexes in which there are actually water on the coasts. So these provide support to ground attacks. 4 is the number of steps that can be of ground forces, typically Marines, that can be carried by the naval unit. 1 is the number of steps that can be sent 24 hexes by air-mobile movement. Naval craft operate both in the strategic map, which here is divided up into different sea areas, at-sea areas. You've got the Bornholm Basin, the North Sea, the Southern Baltic, the Northern Baltic, the Gulf of Bothnia, you've got the Gulf of Finland, and you've also got assorted inshore areas that are associated with the at-sea boxes, and you've got 2 large hexes that refer to islands that are located within the strategic map. The Poland area, land area, with the Southern Baltic, is associated with the all-sea hexes, but they refer specifically to the inshore segment here of the Southern Baltic. Now, the general purpose of the strategic map is to capture the movement of naval, air, and ground forces across the larger general expanse. The strategic purpose of the region is it permits NATO to reinforce from the sea the Baltic areas that would be under pressure from a Soviet attack. And therefore, the Soviets would like to deny NATO access, and NATO would like to secure access. So part of this process is a number of different components that we're going to review. The most important is the determination of sea control. And this follows a simple process, which is on turns when there is no storm, the player will go through a 4-step process of determining control, starting with rolling for inshore areas when a sea control when an at-sea area becomes controlled. An at-sea area can either be controlled by one player or the other player, or it can be contested. The second step is to roll for inshore boxes when the at-sea area is contested. And the third is to roll for inshore boxes when they contradict the ownership or they're contested from the ownership of the at-sea area. Following that, each of the 4 at-sea areas would have to be rolled for control. Now, the North Sea is permanently under the control of NATO, and the Gulf of Finland is permanently under the control of Russia. And so NATO has to proceed through a 4-step process. It always rolls from south to north. So it rolls to determine sea control first of the Bornholm Basin, then the Southern Baltic, then the Northern Baltic, and then the Gulf of Bothnia. Once NATO controls a at-sea area, then it's permanently under their control and it's no longer rolled for, although associated inshore boxes may still be contested. Furthermore, NATO may not control a more northern at-sea area until the more southern is controlled. So it must first control the Bornholm Basin before it can control the Southern Baltic. So if it were to roll control of the Southern Baltic, while it did not control the Bornholm Basin, then any control roll would be reduced to a contested roll. Now, these are determined by using tables. So there is first the sea control table, which is located here. Now, the sea control table essentially requires a die roll, and a roll of 0, 1, 2 puts it in control of the Russians. A roll of 6, 7, 8, 9 puts it in control of NATO, and any other roll results in it being contested. Now, these are the modifiers for the roll. There's a -1 for every carrier or surface action group that's owned by the Russians that's deployed in the area. Although in this particular game there is no Russian carrier unit. It's +1 for every Allied naval unit present, not including American carriers. +2 for every carrier. So this is in the individual sea areas. There's a negative for the sub-threat level, a positive for the anti-submarine warfare level. Those will be elaborated later on. And a -1 to a +1 depending on the whether there's air superiority or air supremacy. Now, there are some specific modifiers that have to do with the control of land areas. There's a +1 or a -1 for each land area. This excludes island land areas that are adjacent, that have a non-destroyed port. So, for example, Tallinn has a port, and if that port is not destroyed, then this then contributes to the control of the northern Baltic, because it is adjacent to the northern Baltic. There's a +2 to a -3 for the control of Gotland, which is Swedish, and it has an effect on the control of the northern and the southern Baltic. So there's a strong incentive for NATO and the Russians to secure this island. There's a +3 and a -3 for the control of Bornholm, which is controlled by Denmark. Again, a strong incentive to control it because of the huge impact it has on controlling the adjacent at-sea areas. Now, there are also some game-specific impacts on inshore areas, which are similar. Gotland and Bornholm have a +3 for the inshore area that's associated with them. So, these sea control roles are very important. Now, let us look at the sub-threat and the anti-submarine warfare threat. These are normally indicated here by 2 markers, and these are the factors that govern the impact they have. So the changing levels of the submarine and threat level and the ASW level, they're given at the beginning of the simulation, and they basically are very often similar in value, but the following events can change these values. Every time there's a friendly naval unit that arrives as a reinforcement, there's a +1. Now, most of the reinforcements are going to be from NATO, and so they're progressively going to have a stronger anti-submarine warfare capability. There's a -1 each time a friendly naval unit is forced to retreat from an at-sea area or an inshore box. Now, this is the standard game, so it doesn't apply to what we're playing here. There is a -1 every time a naval unit receives an X result or a destruction result. So this is, in effect, a better representation than the effect that occurs in the standard game. So an X result is, of course, the equivalent of a destruction result, the equivalent of 3 strikes. There's a -1 every time an originally controlled friendly port is captured or incurs a destroyed result. And of course, if you were to look, for example, at the base at Žemaitija in Lithuania, if that port were to be captured, there would be a -1 to the ASW effect for NATO. And there's a +1 every time an originally controlled friendly port is fully repaired. So it's a possibility of recovering from that effect. So those are the mechanics of the ASW and the submarine threat level. Now, one of the issues that occurs within the the dynamics of this game is contested sea movement. It's not always automatic for units to move from one area to another area. So we're going to look at this table here. So you have to make a roll under certain circumstances that will be elaborated. Whenever there's a winter turn, because of the icebergs and the ice sheets, every single turn is a contested move. But otherwise, contestation, one of its causes is moving into an area that is not controlled by the naval force moving in. So on a roll of 5 or less, sea movement is successful. On a 6 to 8, the movement is aborted, and it results in a strike 1 result. Unless the Navy chooses to return to its original location, it aborts and does not carry through with the operation, then the strike 1 is removed. And if the roll is 9 or greater, there's a strike 2 result, again, unless the unit chooses to abort, and then it avoids suffering the strike 2 results. Now, contested sea movement is affected by the number of SAGs and carriers, plus and minus of both sides, that are in the location where the contested sea movement occurs. So fleets can move into opposing sea areas and effectively impose themselves and modify the contested sea movement. And if they're able to stay there, then in a subsequent sea control, subsequent turn, when sea control is rolled for, they can change the control for that sea area. Plus or minus 1 if at least one inshore box is enemy or friendly or controlled. Minus the anti-submarine warfare level, and this affects only the Allies. Plus the submarine threat level. Again, this affects only the Allies because submarines and ASW are essentially a part of the Russian denial operation. Plus the mine marker density located in the inshore box. Plus 1 for each if Gotland and or Kaliningrad is enemy controlled. Plus 1 if there's a non-allied cruise missile that's applied. That's in the standard game. In the advanced game, it's plus 1 if there's a non-allied side and they expend a cruise missile. If at any time when an at-sea area changes possession and unfriendly units are compelled to retreat, they may remain and instead incur a 1 strike point. If at any time naval units receive damage, either 1 or 2 strikes, they may retreat to a friendly sea area or following a path to a friendly port. And if they're in a friendly port, and only if they're in a friendly port, they can, during the reorganization phase, have one of their strike markers reduced. So it's an advantage to anticipate where a unit, if it's damaged, can find safety in order to minimize its damage. But the path must lead to a port. If ever a naval unit is destroyed or receives an X value, it returns 4 turns later on the game turn track. Now, the overall philosophy that has to be thought of when looking at the strategic map is that the Russian forces have an interest in taking over the Baltic, and NATO needs the Baltic in order to reinforce from land the Baltic areas. And it'd be much faster to reinforce from land than it is to reinforce by ship than it is to drive all the way up from Poland. Now, the Russians have a set of dilemmas. If they take Gotland, then they will trigger Sweden on the side of NATO. If they don't take Gotland, then NATO will have a significant advantage in detecting Russian ships and in sea control roles for the northern and southern Baltic. If the Russians take Bornholm, then it gives them a significant advantage in detecting NATO ships. But they accelerate significantly the Article 5 calculations that accelerate the arrival of NATO reinforcements. But if they don't take Bornholm, then they're very likely to lose control of the Bornholm Basin. And once NATO controls the Bornholm Basin, it's sort of a link of dominoes. It leads to the southern Baltic, to the northern Baltic, and then to the Gulf of Bothnia, and then the Russians are excluded entirely from naval operations. So typically the Russians could take Gotland and Bornholm with airborne forces. They could take Gotland with Airmobile once they've taken enough areas and are close enough to be able to seize it from a Baltic coastal strategic land area. So these are the difficult dilemmas facing the Russians in choosing whether or not to be aggressive in the Baltic or not. There may be no more than one naval unit per hex in the all-sea hexes. Here we have a situation where sea control has been lost both in the inshore box off the coast of Poland and in the southern Baltic. Now, in both instances, the units must retreat. Now, in the case of the at-sea box, the retreat must be done to the closest connected inshore or at-sea box that is friendly. So in this case, the NATO unit could retreat to the Bornholm Basin. Now, the inshore box here, off the coast of Poland, this unit may not retreat. So what it may instead do is retreat to the port in Poland. Now, this port represents the ports on the operational map. So the ship would have to come in and take refuge in one of the ports, as would this amphibious unit, because control of an inshore box implies control of all the all-sea sea hexes that are on the operational map. So this amphibious unit would have to withdraw to a port, as would the other amphibious vessel. Now, naval units can move between these different sea zones and inshore boxes, but the essential rule is they must go through the normal steps. They must move from an inshore box to the associated at-sea box, then to another at-sea box or to an inshore box. But there's no limit to the amount of movements as long as the rule is no more than one at-sea box is occupied per turn. And so for every friendly segment, the ships may be relocated to another area, an inshore box or an at-sea box, or they may proceed to a port. Now, contested sea movement that we looked at earlier on this chart occurs, or rather is required, under the following circumstances. When ships are moving to or from an enemy-controlled at-sea box or inshore box. So it's essentially when the movement is being contested by the presence of another vessel, such as an American SAG moving into the Russian-controlled southern Baltic. Or when a ship goes to or from or through a mine marker area of effect, which could occur on an operational map, as seen here. If these ships wish to leave the area, despite the fact that they're going through the hexes adjacent to the mine, where the mine is having an effect. Or if they're going through a location containing an enemy naval unit, such as a Russian vessel here, and the AMP seeks to go through that AMP, or the American unit is attempting to go through an area with a Russian unit in that sea area. Or between a port and an all-sea hex if the inshore box is not friendly controlled. So if the Americans were trying to escape from their port in Poland and then go to the inshore box here off the coast of Poland, and then to get into the southern Baltic. In that instance, there would also be a contested sea movement. And finally, from an all-sea hex on the operational map to another all-sea hex while the inshore box is not friendly controlled. So for example, this amphibious ship relocating to another port off the coast, it would have to make a roll. Now, if an attempt is made and it fails, as you saw from the contested movement chart, it's possible that there will be strikes inflicted. And if a unit is forced to retreat, or if a unit is forced to return where it came from, it doesn't then have to make a contested movement, a sea movement roll. In order for naval units to be attacked, they must be detected. Detection occurs at the beginning of every turn during the naval unit detection phase, and at the end of every movement when a naval unit moves into a new at-sea box, inshore box, or all-sea hex. Naval units can be moved during the friendly movement phases. So the chart here is consulted, and there's three kinds of detection. There's no detection, area detection, and point detection, of which point detection is the highest value. Any ship in a port is automatically area detected. So these are the modifiers. There's a +3 if there's a storm, +1 if there's overcast. The at-sea box die roll modifier applies to the state that is doing the detecting. So here in the southern Baltic, NATO has a -2 modifier when trying to detect Russian ships. There's the AWACS Advantage modifier, a modifier for any friendly naval unit in the inshore box, minus for any level of air superiority, minus per other friendly naval unit present in the same location, -2 for a allied aircraft carrier, and a minus number for controlled land areas in certain at-sea and associated inshore boxes. And for that we can see the arrows. For example, looking at Gotland, you can see that there is a modifier here by NATO of Russian ships. So it's quite easy to detect Russian ships if Gotland is controlled. So once ships are detected, ships may also attack each other. So in any combat phase, the ships may attack each other of both sides simultaneously. And the essential rule there is that a ship which is undetected can fire first and have its effects felt before ships that are detected can respond. Ships use their support values. In the case of this American SAG, it's the 3 value. And that value indicates on the ship what the attack level is. So if it's got a support value of 3, it's attacking here on the naval 3. Naval 1, 2, and 3 also apply to the strike values of naval aircraft that are attacking ships. So obviously a naval craft, an aircraft with a value of 1 that's from a US aircraft carrier or a French aircraft carrier performs much better than an aircraft with a 1 that is not so dedicated. Now, a special rule here, ships can use their AAA, their anti-aircraft artillery, to attack cruise missiles. When naval ships attack each other, it's as if they were using cruise missiles. Now, normally a ship would have a -1 in its air defense value if it was using CIWS, or close-in weapon systems. The Americans get an additional -1. So this is effectively AAA fire on the advanced air defense fire table when operating against incoming cruise missiles. And you can see here that an X and an A value has no effect for standoff air units, strikes, or cruise missiles. So when using the value of the aircraft, the X and the A value has no effect against those other systems. It only works against cruise missiles and airstrikes. Now, ships may attack each other as well on the all C hexes on the operational map if they're within 10 hexes of each other. As well, and this is important, aircraft with an air superiority mission may conduct interceptions over the Baltic against other air missions if there is an early detection. As well, and this is a special rule, aircraft carriers that have aircraft in the air superiority mission box may conduct interceptions, and when the interception is complete, they return to the air superiority mission box. They don't go to the flown box. Unless, of course, they were aborted, then they would go to the aborted box. So it's the equivalent of CAP, Combat Air Patrol, in which they're flying overhead and they're available, constantly available, to repeat their interceptions. Now, ultimately, the recipient of an attack may choose whether to use their national air defense capabilities or to use those capabilities specific to the ships, which are indicated here on the map. There are 3 ways to deploy mines: by ship, by submarine, and by aircraft. A ship, instead of moving, may remain in its own or in its own hex and then deploy a mine marker density 2 in its own hex or the hex that is adjacent to it. It can then freely exit the mine marker area in effect without having to make a contested C-roll movement later on. Mines may be placed in an all-C hex or a coastal hex. So we put here, or it can be put on a coastal hex. And if it's put on a coastal hex that contains a port or a beach, then it affects both the hex itself and the adjacent coastal hexes. The Russians may also lay a mine using submarines. They would subtract 1 from their submarine threat level and place a density 1 mine marker in any eligible hex during their movement phase. Although they cannot do it if it would reduce their submarine threat level to below 1. An aerial mining mission is possible in any non-storm turn, and each player can allocate 1 aerial mining mission per turn. And if they succeed, they deploy a 1 density mine marker in the target hex. This is like a normal air mission. They can assign up to 2 escorts and a wild weasel. And if the target is along a friendly coastline and not next to an enemy naval unit or within 2 hexes of a headquarters, it undergoes local detection, and if detected, local SAM, but not AAA. Otherwise, you can use a local enemy naval craft's air defense fire to shoot at that mission. The mine marker aircraft itself is treated as a 0 in parentheses if there's an early detection and it's intercepted by enemy aircraft. Now, the mine marker itself affects movement. When it's in an all-C hex, it only affects that hex. When it's in a coastal hex, it affects all adjacent all-C hexes. Mine markers modify the contested C movement die roll if a naval unit is using that hex, or if there's sea transport that attempts to leave or enter that area of effect. And so you'd make a single roll as the unit moves from hex to hex. Overlapping mine areas are not cumulative. So enemy mine markers may be cleared during the mine clearance step of the air-naval phase. Here is the chart for it. So if the associated inshore box is friendly controlled, Each player may attempt to clear up to 2 mine markers during the mine clearance step, and they roll separately for each. On a roll of 0 to 3, they reduce the mine marker by a density of 1, so from 2 to 1 or 1 to 0, as the case may be. And they modify the die roll by -2 if there's a friendly naval unit that is present in the area of effect. In other words, either adjacent to the mine or on top of the mine. Special Operations Forces have a variety of missions that can be conducted on the operational map and against various tables. So let's take a look at some of those operations. The first operation they can conduct is a raid. They can attack airfields, bridges, installations including air bases and ports, mobile supply units, helicopter units deployed on the map, and supply depots if they're detected. And let's take a look at the chart and how it's conducted. Special Forces units can be received as reinforcements during the course of the game. So you find the intersection of the target, you find the type of terrain they're located, on which they're located, you look for that intersection, and then you roll the die, and there are modifiers, -1 if there's a storm, -1 if the raid is against a bridge, +1 if there's a less than brigade occupying the space with an attack value of at least 1, +2 if it's by more than a brigade, +1 if it's an attack on a theater weapon like a cruise missile or a Scud or a SAM system. The roll then reveals the result. X is a step loss, 2 is 2 strikes, and 1 is a 1 strike result. And here you can see the roll that has to be made immediately after the attack to see if the Special Forces unit survives. These are the modifiers, -3 for the US or UK if they're trying to get retrieved, -1 for non-US, non-UK, +1 if it's a raid, +1 if it's interdiction. And this is essentially the roll. If the roll is less than or equal to 7, the unit's eliminated. Or greater than or equal to 7, it's eliminated. Less than or equal to 6, it survives. So that's the first operation that can be conducted. So in this instance, a raid could be deployed against a mobile supply unit. And you would conduct one raid with 1 Special Forces unit per unit in that target hex. The second operation is to conduct a detection operation or recon. It can conduct a raid against any headquarters, supply depot, or mobile supply unit for a raid as well, as I just showed you. But it could also conduct that raid against a headquarters unit, for example. It can conduct a raid on the enemy detection or the SAM track. And this is the SAM track that you saw before used in the air combat, which is essentially the track right here. So this track can be attacked and reduced to Special Forces raids. Again, the raid for that is used, this chart here is used, this column. Again, the die roll is here, the modifiers apply, and the value on the detection or the SAM track is reduced by -2 or -1, or the value of the strategic weapons, the missiles, for example. An enemy airfield or installation or any detected enemy ground unit is eligible as a target for an SOF targeting mission. In this mission, the Special Forces unit is deployed, and a roll is made on this column, and if a T results, that unit is targeted, and there's actually a counter that is deployed. Now the modifier for the targeting is a negative applied to the die roll of a strike operation, whether it's a strike from aircraft or a strike from a missile attack, any form of strike. The US has a -2 modifier. Other countries have a -1 or a variety of other modifiers, depending on their nationality. So this is the equivalent of a long-range recce patrol and basically putting a laser beam onto the target to facilitate the impact of the high-precision weapons. The next mission, a raid can be conducted against attack helicopters based in a non-airbase airfield city or urban hex. And this would use so this would be conducted as a raid, and then the impact would occur onto the helicopter. The SOF unit may also conduct a reconnaissance operation against an undetected enemy unit. The unit might simply be difficult to detect in deeper territory, let's say here in Kaliningrad, up in the north. And if it succeeds, then the unit is detected. And for that, we use the chart over here, the recon chart. Again, rolls are made, there are modifiers, and D detects the unit, which is an intersection of the type of unit and the type of terrain in which it's located. And finally, land-based theater weapons can be targeted for special missions raids. Now, there's greater details in the rules about the different options, but special forces have a huge multiplier effect and have to be intelligently integrated with other operations. Nuclear weapons. Both sides have tactical nuclear weapons. The typical sequence is the non-allied player will deploy a nuclear weapon first, and then a NATO player. Each application of a nuclear weapon reduces the total number of tactical nuclear weapons by 1. Whenever a nuclear weapon is deployed, there's a 5% chance that it'll fail and not function at all. Players may not put tactical nuclear weapons on their own urban areas or city hexes. Obviously, they don't want to kill their own people, even if they're hiding in the basement. So the effect of a nuclear weapon, in this case, one has been dropped by NATO forces on this Belarusian stack, is every unit in the stack suffers a step loss, and the survivors have a strike 2 marker applied to them. So here we have the units. All of them are flipped over. The artillery unit is destroyed as a consequence. A strike 2 marker is placed atop that unit, and then the fallout effects counter is put atop those units. If an airbase had been destroyed, it would have been eliminated, or a port, it would have been eliminated, or fortifications or airfields, and there would have been a -2 modifier for the collateral damage table for resolving what units were destroyed at the airbase. Now, in addition, there is a -4 efficiency rating loss for Belarusian forces and a -3 efficiency rating for all other forces that are located in a hex that has this nuclear fallout effect. And you can see that indicated in the center of the hex. There's a -2 efficiency rating for any unit deployed adjacent to the nuclear fallout effects. As well, a leg mobile unit can only enter this type of hex if it expends its entire movement point allowance, and motorized and mechanized units must spend an additional +4 to enter this type of hex. No supply line can be traced through a nuclear fallout hex, but you can still trace into the hex if that's where the unit is located. If ever this is deployed on a hex with in an inshore box where there's a ship, or an at sea box where there's a ship or multiple ships, one ship unit is removed. There are no lingering effects at sea for these nuclear weapons effects. There is a 3 victory point allocated to the opponent every time their units are struck by a nuclear weapon. An additional 10 victory points are allotted if an urban or city hex was struck. When to use local detection and air defense fire, and when to use normal detection and air defense fire. Here you can see local detection, and here you can see local SAM and local AAA on the advanced air defense fire table. For that, we have a table. I've highlighted mine to make it a lot more legible than what is provided with the simulation. Let's see if I can get it down here to hold it into place. Now, it sounds incredibly confusing, but let's just go through the different circumstances, and I think you'll see the logic behind it. The fundamental principle is that states have a set air defense network, which is so large it cannot be degraded or completely destroyed. And you can see it, for example, the Russians have a fixed air defense system that can never be degraded within Russia itself. And in the Russian holding box, which is the same value. So NATO's is dependent instead on the air defense track, which includes detection, SAM, and AAA. So as a country's armed forces advance out of their territory, they bring with them the values on the air defense track in the form of heavy air defense systems and radars that advance with the headquarters units. All other air defense systems, or all the presence of enemy air defense systems in other areas will be significantly degraded. And furthermore, attack helicopter units are able to resist some of the higher air defense systems by flying very low. So, if you have an airstrike from an air unit, or it's conducting a combat support mission, if it's inside enemy territory and it's within 2 hexes of an enemy headquarters, so perhaps it's the Russians conducting an airstrike in Poland, or it's an American aircraft striking Poland within 2 hexes of an American of a Russian headquarters or installation. In other words, a headquarters that was Polish originally and captured by the Russians, then we use the normal air defense value. That's to say, the ones from this chart, right? It stands to reason because the Russians are pulling forward their assets to the air bases. Now, if the air unit is attacking the air defense track itself, like the Wild Weasels, of course, they would use the normal air defense track, unless they're attacking the air defense track inside Russia, in which case they would be using the Russian air defense values, right? Again, sort of common sense. If in all other cases, it will be local air defense. So if the Americans are hitting the Russians in Poland beyond 2 hexes from a Russian headquarters unit, then we use local air defense fire. Now, if it's an attack helicopter, whether it's conducting a strike mission or combat support, it's always going to be local detection, local AAA, local air defense. And this is because it's able to, it flies so low, it's able to evade the line of sight from the major weapon systems just because of the curvature of the Earth, essentially. Now, air-mobile movement. These are ground troops carried by helicopter. If they're flying inside enemy territory or within 2 hexes of an enemy headquarters, that's to say an American helicopter unit flying within 2 hexes of a Russian headquarters in Poland, it's still local, but there's no AAA. So if above, in other words, you're flying in enemy territory or within 2 hexes of enemy territory, and it's within 2 hexes of an enemy ground unit or an installation, if it's detected, there's also local AAA. Obviously, if you're flying near a ground unit, you're going to have a various ground-based AAA, and you're going to have local radars from those units and the air bases. Now, if the airmobile unit's occurring entirely in a friendly country, taking off in Poland and landing in Poland, beyond 2 hexes of an enemy unit, beyond 2 hexes of an enemy ground unit, and not near an enemy captured installation or an enemy installation, then it is going to automatically succeed. There's no roll to be made. Now, for paradropping and air transport would be flight from one airbase to another. If it flies into or over enemy territory, then you're looking at normal detection and SAM. There's no AAA because these aircraft fly too high for that to occur. If it passes over an at-sea or an inshore box with an enemy naval unit, and then an enemy naval unit can be anywhere, can be at sea or in the inshore box, then you're going to have the naval air defense value. But again, not AAA because the aircraft fly too high. If the air transport mission or the paradrop, the target hex is in a friendly country, but within 2 hexes of an enemy headquarters, and the carrying side, let's say the Russians are trying to land paratroopers into the islands in the Baltic, and the American and the Russian side has any level of air superiority, or it's contested, you use the local air defense. Basically, there's no possible aircraft that can intercept, and the interception detection grid is not functioning very well. If, on the other hand, it's the non-mission side has any level of air support. In other words, the Russians are conducting a airdrop onto islands in the Baltic. The Americans have either advantage, superiority, or supremacy. Then the Russians would have to run the gauntlet of the American air defense values. Now, if the mission's target hex is in a friendly or a neutral country, let's say the Americans are landing into Bornholm or Gotland, owned by Sweden, and it's not within 2 hexes of enemy territory, and the Americans have any level of air superiority, advantage, superiority, or supremacy, then it automatically succeeds. Essentially, they control the air, and they're flying within their friendly territory. Now, if the non-mission side has any level of air superiority, they're normal detection values. So you might be flying into Sweden, but if the Russians control the skies, well, you have to run their air defense system. Next, we have air and cruise missile naval strikes. These are attacks against ships, either by aircraft or by the normal permittable missile strikes. First of all, it's got to be done against a detected naval unit, either area detected or point detected, area detected if it's in port. Now, it can either be in a hex, which is an all-sea hex. If it is, then the choice can be either the normal air defense values or the naval air defense values, right? And these can be picked. These are different types of detection, SAM, and AAA values for the American carriers, the Russian SAGs, the American SAGs, the American AMPs, the British AMPs, and other carriers and surface action groups. So in that instance, it's you choose in this case the Russians would choose the better of the two. If, however, there was the target was a detected naval unit in inshore or at sea zone, then they would be the air defense value. So if it's not in an all-sea hex, which is the major body of water, it's in an inshore, then it's the ship itself, because the air defense system is not going to reach into all the alcoves and bays of a coastal area. And finally, aerial mining. If the mining is occurring along an enemy coast, such as the Russians perhaps dropping mines off the coast of Poland, and it's adjacent to an enemy naval unit or within 2 hexes of an enemy headquarters, then it's the normal ADF. If it's if it's in or passes over sea or inshore box with an enemy naval unit, then it's the naval unit's air defense value. So if it's into an inshore box on the strategic map, here's an inshore box in the Gulf of Riga, then it would involve the ship's air defense values. Otherwise, it's local air defense value. So I hope that you understand the underlying philosophy of the process. This is a form that comes with the standard printouts and is available for the students to print out on their own. Deliberate damage. If an enemy unit is within 2 hexes of an installation, which includes ports and air bases, or an airfield, then the friendly state to deny the use of that airfield and to compel the opponent to try to repair it may deliberately blow it up. Here you can see the chart. If a 1 is rolled, it's destroyed. Otherwise, there's a strike 2 or a strike 1. There's no collateral damage because, of course, friendly aircraft and helicopters are evacuated from the site. And you can see the modifiers. -2 if there's a friendly division in or adjacent, or a -1 if there's a friendly brigade. In this case, we've got an entire Belarusian division. -2 if there's a friendly headquarters within support range, because obviously it sends out the engineers to blow up the facility. +3 if the attempt is in the same phase as the capture. So you are allowed to conduct a deliberate damage operation right at the instant in which it's captured. And +3 if there's a clearing marker in the hex. Bridge demolition. Bridge demolition may only be attempted if there is a non-mobile supply unit ground unit that's in a hex adjacent to the hex side where the bridge is located, in which instance it has to roll a 6 or less to blow up the bridge. If there is an enemy unit that is in a hex adjacent to the hex side where the bridge is to be destroyed, there's a +1 modifier, which makes it 10% more difficult to blow up the bridge. Bridge repair. A bridge may be repaired if a friendly headquarters is within 4 motorized movement points of the location and it expends a supply point, and there is no enemy force adjacent to the bridge unless there is a friendly unit adjacent to the bridge. And then the bridge is repaired. Combat replacements. There are land-based replacements and there are replacements for air units. In the simulation, it'll very often specify the nationality of the replacement or the alliance of the replacement, and states can only get replacements from the source specified in the rules. So you look at the chart here, there is a step recovery and reconstitution. Reconstitution means rebuilding a unit completely from the point of destruction. Units cannot be rebuilt if they were isolated or they surrendered because of isolation. So here we have the 18th Recon Polish Regiment, the equivalent of a brigade. It's on its lower, the weaker step. We presume it's been destroyed. Now, because it's a brigade, we would consult this part of the chart over here. It would cost 2 replacement points to put this piece onto a map, and it would have to be reconstituted on a map in their home country or an allied country in a friendly controlled town, city, urban, or an installation hex, or adjacent to a friendly unit. And this has to be done at least 2 hexes away from an enemy unit. Now, you cannot completely rebuild a unit in the same turn. You could, however, spend the step recovery, and for brigade, it would be another 2 points. And then the unit would be in the second turn turned over to its full strength side. Now notice that some units cannot be reconstituted, including airborne, aircraft with units with intrinsic airmobile capability, Marines. These can never be reconstituted either as brigades or divisions. Now for headquarters and supreme headquarters, to recover a step costs a supply point, but to completely rebuild the headquarters costs 2 supply points and 1 replacement point. And for Supreme Headquarters, it's significantly more expensive, as you can see. Now, in addition, aircraft can also be reconstituted. And for that, we use a chart which is on the map. In effect, it costs 2 supply points to replace an air unit that's been damaged. And it costs 2 supply points to reach into and pick up a unit that's been destroyed. Now that selection has to be done randomly. And this simulation, we're using the optional rule where if a F-22 is picked up or an F-35 by the US or the NATO player, it costs 3 supply points. Again, these units cannot be completely rebuilt in one turn. An additional supply point purchase would have to be made in the next turn to flip that half-strength air unit back to its full-strength side. During the game, there's a natural repair process in which strike 1 markers are removed at the end of each turn, and strike 2 markers are reduced to a strike 1 marker. However, there are some installations like air bases and ports that are going to end up getting destroyed. And for that, we refer to the repair chart here. And for the expenditure of 2 supply points, a destroyed airbase, airfield, or port can have its destroyed marker removed and a strike 2 marker put there instead. And then it's going to naturally repair itself gradually over time. Destruction of that airfield, airbase, or port by an enemy force will not give additional victory points until that facility is completely repaired. Otherwise, you get sort of unrealistic victory point awards for an attempt to damage and destroy airfields that are being repaired. The air bases that are being repaired have to have their strike markers rotated 180 degrees to ensure that during the air superiority step to determine which aircraft are put in the flown box, that those strike markers, which were inflicted in the distant past, are not a part of the calculation. And of course, any additional not additional, but rather those strikes do not contribute to collateral damage. Players may also spend up to 4 supply points per turn repairing components of their air defense tract. And for every 4 supply points, 1 AAA point can be improved. And for every 2 supply points, 1 SAM point or 1 detection point can be repaired. And so by the expenditure of supply points, repair can be affected on the air defense track, so it's not the damage there is not irreversible, and ports and air bases and airfields can be brought back into operation.